What would you do if the one thing you wanted most in the world was the exact thing your body refused to give you? For 32-year-old Abigail Mercer, the word barren was a life sentence. Cast aside and broken, she risked everything on a desperate newspaper ad from a Montana mountain man drowning in grief and 6 feral children. But the Bitterroot Mountains hold dark secrets, and the hardest battles aren't fought against the wolves, they are fought within the heart. The ink on the crumpled newspaper was barely legible, smudged by the grime of a St. Louis boarding house and the bitter tears Abigail Mercer had shed over it. It was the winter of 1878. Abigail was 32, a woman whose life had been meticulously dismantled by a single medical diagnosis: barren. The doctor's word had echoed in her ears for 3 years. It had cost her a marriage to a man who saw her only as a defective vessel, and it had cost her the respect of her high society family, who quickly shipped her off to avoid the quiet, judgmental whispers of their social circle. She was completely alone, surviving on dwindling funds and a spirit that felt as hollowed out as a rotting log. But then, she saw the ad in the back pages of the Western Gazette. Wanted, a woman of strong constitution to help raise 6 children in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana Territory. Must not fear hard work, isolation, or harsh winters. No romance offered, only a roof, food, and a home. Micah Montgomery. 6 children. To any other woman in her right mind, it was a terrifying prospect. A mountain man in the unforgiving wilderness of Montana, saddled with half a dozen orphans? It was a recipe for an early grave. But to Abigail, who had spent the last 3 years staring at empty cradles and listening to the phantom laughter of children she would never bear, it read like a reprieve from God himself. She didn't write a letter in response. She simply packed her meager belongings into a single leather trunk, bought a train ticket west, and let the rhythmic clacking of the iron rails carry her toward her fate. The journey was a brutal baptism into the realities of the frontier. Days turned into weeks as the plush velvet seats of the eastern trains gave way to the bone-rattling wooden benches of stagecoaches. By the time Abigail arrived in the logging outpost of Darby, Montana, she was covered in a thick layer of dust, her fine eastern clothes frayed and her hands trembling from exhaustion. Darby was less of a town and more of a muddy scar carved into the towering, snow-capped pines. It was here, in front of a drafty mercantile, that she first laid eyes on Micah Montgomery. He was a mountain of a man, making the draft horses hitched to his wagon look small. Dressed in worn buckskin and a heavy bearskin coat, Micah possessed a rugged, terrifying kind of vitality. His dark hair was overly long, brushing the collar of his coat, and his jaw was shadowed by a thick, untamed beard. But it was his eyes that made Abigail's breath catch. They were the color of a bruised winter sky, flinty and exhausted, holding a depth of sorrow that mirrored her own. Abigail straightened her spine, gripping her satchel tightly, and stepped off the wooden boardwalk. "Mr. Montgomery?" Micah turned slowly. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her tailored, albeit dusty, wool coat and the delicate lace at her throat. A deep frown etched itself into his weathered face. "You're the Mercer woman?" His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like boulders shifting deep in a cave. "I am," Abigail said, keeping her chin high. "I saw your advertisement. I realize I didn't write ahead, but I am here, and I am ready to work." Micah let out a harsh, humorless scoff. He walked toward her, his heavy boots sinking into the freezing mud. "You're an Easterner. You look like a stiff wind would blow you back to the Mississippi. I need a woman who can chop wood and wrestle a fever out of an infant, not a lady who needs her tea steeped." "I do not need tea," Abigail snapped, the sudden spark of anger overriding her fear. "And I can work. You asked for a woman with a strong constitution? I assure you, Mr. Montgomery, surviving what I have survived takes a constitution of iron. Now, do you want my help with those 6 children, or do you intend to let them raise themselves like wild animals while you stand here insulting the only person who answered your plea?" For a long, tense moment, the mountain man simply stared at her. The wind howled through the pines, biting at Abigail's cheeks, but she didn't break eye contact. Finally, Micah turned away and grabbed her heavy leather trunk as easily as if it were a hat box. He tossed it into the back of his wagon. "It's a 4-hour ride up the mountain," he grunted, climbing onto the buckboard. "If you freeze to death on the way, I ain't digging a grave till spring." Abigail swallowed hard, lifted her skirts, and climbed up beside him. The ride was a masterclass in silence. The wagon lurched and groaned up narrow, winding switchbacks, the dense forest swallowing them whole. The temperature plummeted as they climbed higher into the bitterroots, the air growing thin and sharp as glass. Micah didn't speak. He just kept his eyes on the treacherous path, his large, calloused hands expertly guiding the team of draft horses. As dusk began to settle, painting the snow in shades of violet and gray, a sprawling log cabin finally came into view. It was sturdy, built from massive timber, with a stone chimney puffing thin, grayish smoke into the twilight. "We're here," Micah said abruptly, pulling the horses to a halt. Abigail looked at the cabin. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs. Behind that thick wooden door were 6 children. 6 lives she desperately wanted to help shape. But as she would soon learn, wanting to be a mother and surviving a broken family were 2 entirely different things. When Micah pushed open the heavy oak door of the cabin, a wave of heat, noise, and the distinct smell of wood smoke and unwashed bodies rolled out to greet them. The main room was massive, dominating the ground floor, but it was in a state of absolute chaos. Iron pots crusted with old food sat on the massive hearth. Stacks of animal pelts were piled in the corners. And standing in the center of the room, looking like a pack of cornered wolves, were the Montgomery children. Abigail stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim, amber light cast by the roaring fire. The oldest, a boy who looked to be about 14, stood at the front of the pack. He had his father's dark hair and a jaw set with an anger so fierce it felt almost physical. This was Josiah. Behind him stood a girl of 12, Clara. She looked small for her age, her shoulders slumped with a weariness no child should carry. She was bouncing a wailing, red-faced baby on her hip, Seth, the 1-year-old whose birth had cost their mother, Rebecca, her life. Scattered around the edges of the room were the middle children, Emmett, 9, with a wild mop of hair and dirt smeared across his cheeks. Wyatt, 7, hiding quietly behind a wooden chair, his large brown eyes wide with apprehension. And 4-year-old Sarah, clutching a ragged cloth doll to her chest and sucking her thumb. "Josiah," Micah said gruffly, dropping Abigail's trunk onto the floorboards with a thud. "This is Mrs. Mercer. She's going to be staying with us. To help." Josiah didn't blink. He glared at Abigail with an intensity that made her blood run cold. "We don't need help, especially not from some fancy lady dressed up in Sunday wool." "Watch your mouth," Micah warned, a sharp edge entering his voice. "She's here to cook, clean, and keep you lot from killing each other while I run the trap lines. You'll show her respect." Josiah spat on the floor near Abigail's boots. "She won't last a week." With that, the boy spun on his heel and stormed toward a wooden ladder that led to the loft, disappearing into the shadows above. Abigail's heart sank, but she forced a gentle smile, removing her gloves. She looked at Clara, who was struggling to quiet the crying baby. "May I?" Abigail asked softly, taking a step toward the girl. She reached her arms out for baby Seth. Clara hesitated, looking at her father. Micah gave a curt nod, exhausted, already turning away to take off his heavy coat. Clara carefully handed the wailing infant over. The moment Seth's warm, solid weight settled into Abigail's arms, a profound, aching shockwave ripped through her chest. It had been years since she had held a child. She instinctively cradled his head, swaying gently, humming a low, soft tune her own mother had taught her. The smell of him, sour milk and wood smoke, was overwhelming, but to Abigail it was intoxicating. Within minutes, Seth's wails reduced to wet sniffles, his heavy eyelids drooping shut against her shoulder. She looked up to find Micah watching her. For a split second, the hardened shell around the mountain man seemed to crack, revealing a deep, agonizing vulnerability. He saw another woman holding his son, standing in the exact spot his wife used to stand. The pain in his eyes was blinding. He immediately tore his gaze away, his jaw clenching. "Clara will show you to the back room," Micah muttered, his voice thick. "I've got to check the horses." He practically fled the cabin, slamming the door behind him. The first few days in the Montgomery cabin were a waking nightmare of labor and rejection. Abigail had promised hard work, but the reality of frontier living tested the limits of her endurance. Her soft, uncalloused hands quickly blistered from hauling buckets of icy water from the creek. Her back ached endlessly from bending over the hearth, scrubbing cast-iron pots, and baking endless loaves of bread to feed the ravenous children. But the physical toll was nothing compared to the emotional warfare waged by the older boys. Josiah was a master of quiet sabotage. Abigail would leave a bucket of fresh water by the door, only to find it mysteriously kicked over. The clean laundry she hung by the fire would end up tossed onto the dirty floorboards. He never spoke to her unless forced, and when he did, his words were dipped in venom. Emmett, the 9-year-old, was like a feral creature. He refused to sit at the table, snatching food and retreating to the corners of the room. He bit Abigail once when she tried to wash his dirt-caked neck, leaving a harsh purple bruise on her wrist. Only little Sarah and baby Seth seemed to accept her. Wyatt remained a silent observer, and Clara was polite but incredibly guarded, terrified of betraying the memory of her dead mother by getting too close to the stranger. On the 5th night, after a grueling day of scrubbing the floors with lye soap, Abigail was organizing a small wooden cabinet near the hearth. Tucked behind a stack of tin plates, she found a beautifully carved wooden music box. Without thinking, she reached out and opened the lid. A delicate, tinkling melody filled the quiet cabin. Suddenly, a massive, rough hand slammed the lid shut, nearly catching her fingers. Abigail gasped, spinning around. Micah towered over her, his chest heaving, his face dark with a fury she had never seen before. "Don't," he growled, his voice shaking with a dangerous intensity. "Don't you ever touch her things." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. She stepped back, her hands trembling. I was just cleaning, Mr. Montgomery. I didn't know." "You don't touch this box. You don't touch the quilt on that rocking chair. You are here to work, Mrs. Mercer, not to replace Rebecca. You could never replace her." The words struck Abigail like a physical blow. The shame and the ever-present reminder of her own inadequacy flared up, burning her eyes with unshed tears. She looked at this broken, towering man, realizing that she was a ghost in this house, living in the shadow of a woman who had given him 6 beautiful children, something Abigail could never, ever do. "I have no intention of replacing your wife, Micah," Abigail whispered, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "I am well aware of my place." She turned and fled into the small, freezing back room that served as her quarters, shutting the door behind her. That night, buried under thin woolen blankets, Abigail Mercer cried until she couldn't breathe. But when morning came, she wiped her face, tied her apron tight, and walked back out to stoke the fire. She had nowhere else to go. As November bled into a brutal December, the Bitterroot Mountains were swallowed by snow. The drifts piled up to the windowsills, effectively sealing the Montgomery family and Abigail inside a claustrophobic wooden box. Despite the bitter cold and the hostility from Micah and Josiah, Abigail refused to break. She found a strange, punishing rhythm in the survival of it all. She mended torn trousers until her fingers bled. She learned to skin the rabbits Micah brought in from his traps, ignoring the nausea that roiled in her stomach. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dynamics in the cabin began to shift. It started with Wyatt. The quiet 7-year-old had been suffering from a terrible, hacking cough for days. One night, when Micah was out late checking the perimeter for wolves, Wyatt's cough turned wet and desperate. He couldn't catch his breath, his face turning a terrifying shade of gray. Panic erupted. Clara began to cry, and even Josiah looked terrified, frozen by the hearth. Abigail didn't hesitate. She remembered a remedy her grandmother used to make. She shoved past Josiah, grabbed a heavy iron kettle, and filled it with water and a handful of dried pine needles and mint she had found in the root cellar. She boiled the water rapidly until thick, pungent steam rose into the air. Throwing a heavy wool blanket over her own head and Wyatt's, she created a makeshift tent over the steaming kettle. "Breathe, Wyatt," she coaxed softly, her face inches from his in the stifling, fragrant heat. "Breathe with me. In and out. Slowly, my brave boy." She stayed under that sweltering blanket for an hour, holding the small boy against her chest, patting his back firmly to loosen the fluid in his lungs until his breathing finally leveled out into a peaceful rhythm. He fell asleep in her arms. When Abigail finally pulled the blanket back, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, she found Micah standing in the doorway, covered in snow. He had watched the entire thing. The anger that usually hardened his features was gone, replaced by a quiet, profound awe. He looked at Abigail not as an intruding Easterner, but as a savior. He didn't say a word, but later that night, when Abigail retreated to her freezing room, she found a thick, heavy bear pelt draped over her thin cot, a peace offering. The real turning point, however, came a week later, accompanied by blood and terror. Emmett, the wild 9-year-old, had snuck out of the cabin to play in the deep snowdrifts while Micah was chopping wood around the back. Abigail was hanging wet laundry by the fire when she heard a scream that stopped her heart. She bolted out the front door, wearing nothing but her cotton dress and boots. Emmett had climbed onto the icy roof of the low-slung root cellar and slipped. He lay in the snow, screaming in agony, his right leg twisted at a sickening, unnatural angle. Abigail reached him just as Micah came sprinting around the corner, axe in hand. "My leg! PA! It hurts!" Emmett shrieked, thrashing in the snow. "Hold him still!" Micah yelled, dropping the axe and dropping to his knees. "If the bone breaks the skin, he'll bleed out or rot." Micah's massive hands hovered over the boy's leg, but they were trembling. The great mountain man, who could wrestle a grizzly and weather any storm, was suddenly paralyzed by the sight of his own son's agony. "Micah, look at me!" Abigail commanded, her voice cutting through the panic like a whip. "I need you to pull the leg straight on, my count. We have to set it now before the muscles spasm tight." Micah looked at her, his blue eyes wide with panic. "I can't. I might break it worse." "You won't," she said fiercely. She knelt in the freezing snow, burying her hands into the icy slush to grip Emmett's thigh firmly, anchoring the boy. "I have him. You pull the ankle. 1, 2, 3. Micah pulled. Emmett let out a blood-curdling scream and passed out cold from the pain, but the bones slipped back into alignment with a sickening pop. Adrenaline dumped from Abigail's system. She collapsed back into the snow, shivering violently, her hands bruised and scraped raw from the ice. Micah quickly gathered Emmett's limp body into his massive arms and carried him inside, yelling for Clara to bring wood for splints. Hours later, the cabin was finally quiet. Emmett's leg was splinted and bound tightly, the boy sleeping heavily under the influence of a small drop of whiskey Micah had rubbed on his gums. Abigail sat alone at the rough-hewn kitchen table. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving her freezing, exhausted, and trembling. She held her right arm against her chest. In her rush to help Emmett, she had gouged her forearm deeply against a jagged piece of ice. Blood had dried down to her wrist. Footsteps sounded heavily behind her. Micah walked over, carrying a bowl of warm water and a clean rag. He didn't ask. He just pulled out a chair, sat beside her, and gently took her injured arm in his massive, rough hands. The contrast was startling. His hands were scarred, thick, and stained with dirt and hard labor, while hers were pale and trembling. Yet, his touch was impossibly gentle as he began to wash the dried blood from her skin. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the crackling of the fire. "You saved him today," Micah finally murmured, not looking up from her wound. His voice was thick with emotion. "You saved Wyatt, too. I've been awful to you, Abigail." It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it on his lips sent a strange, warm shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "You were protecting your family," Abigail said softly, "and your wife's memory. I understand." Micah stopped wiping her arm. He looked up, his storm cloud eyes locking onto hers. The proximity was dizzying. Rebecca died bringing Seth into this world. The doctor in Derby said she was too frail, that another baby would kill her. But we wanted a big family. I blamed myself every day since she passed. When you came, seeing you with the kids, it felt like a betrayal. But you're not trying to take her place. You're just trying to love them. He paused, searching her eyes. Why did you come, Abigail? Truly, a beautiful woman like you. You could have married some wealthy man back east. Why answer an ad from a broken man in the middle of nowhere? The word beautiful hung in the air between them, making Abigail's breath catch. But his question brought the old, suffocating shame rushing back. She looked down at his large hands holding hers. It was time for the truth. Because no man back east would have me, Micah, she whispered, her voice cracking. Tears she had held back for months finally spilled over her lashes. I was married for 4 years, but I am defective, Micah frowned, his thumb instinctively brushing a tear from her cheek. Defective? What are you talking about? I am barren, Abigail choked out, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. She pulled her hands away from his, wrapping her arms protectively around her own waist. The doctors told me I can never bear children. My husband divorced me for it. I was a laughingstock, an empty, useless woman. I came here because it was the only way, the only chance I would ever have to be a mother. I just wanted a family. Silence stretched between them, heavy and profound. Micah looked at her. Truly looked at her, seeing the magnitude of her heartbreak. He slowly reached out, wrapping his large, warm hand around her trembling shoulder, pulling her slightly toward him in a gesture of profound comfort and solidarity. You aren't useless, Abigail, he whispered fiercely, and you ain't empty. It was a beautiful, fragile moment of connection, a bridge finally built between two grieving, shattered souls. But neither of them noticed the shadow standing at the top of the loft ladder. Josiah gripped the wooden rung so tightly his knuckles were white. He had heard every word. The anger that had been simmering inside him for weeks suddenly boiled over into a toxic, misguided rage. She doesn't care about us, Josiah thought, his jaw locked. She's just using us, using my mother's family to play house because she's broken. Josiah backed away into the shadows of the loft, his eyes burning with tears and fury. Abigail Mercer thought she had won his father over, but Josiah swore to himself right then and there he was going to run this barren imposter out of the Bitterroot Mountains if it was the last thing he ever did. The fragile peace that had begun to blossom in the Montgomery cabin was completely invisible to Josiah. To the 14-year-old boy, the quiet moments of camaraderie between his father and the Eastern woman were not signs of healing. They were acts of treason. Josiah's mind twisted Abigail's heartbreaking confession into something deeply cynical. She doesn't love us, he told himself repeatedly as he chopped firewood with vicious, angry swings. She just needs us to prove she isn't a broken, useless thing. We're just a chore to her, a project. Driven by the fierce, blinding loyalty of a grieving son, Josiah decided it was time to prove once and for all that Abigail Mercer did not belong in the Bitterroots. He just needed the right opportunity to expose her as the frail, incompetent Easterner he believed her to be. That opportunity arrived in the dead of January, on a morning when the sky was a bruised, heavy purple, threatening a massive squall. Micah had ridden out early on his gelding to meet a supply wagon down at the valley crossroads, leaving Abigail in charge. The wind was already beginning to howl, rattling the thick glass panes of the cabin windows. Inside, the fire roared, and Abigail was rolling out dough for biscuits, a smudge of flour on her cheek, humming quietly to baby Seth, who was cooped up in a wooden cradle near the hearth. Josiah walked in, stomping the snow off his boots. He looked at the sky through the window, then looked at Abigail. A dark, reckless plan formed in his mind. Mrs. Mercer, Josiah said, his voice unusually polite, though tight. Abigail paused, wiping her hands on her apron, surprised by the address. Yes, Josiah? PA told me to check the snare lines down by the Lower Creek Gorge before the snow hits, he lied, keeping his eyes fixed on the floorboards. But Emmett's leg is hurting him awful, and Clara can't get him to take his willow bark tea. If I don't check those lines, the wolves will get the catches, and Pa will tan my hide for losing the meat. Abigail looked at the boy. This was the first time he had ever asked for her help, the first time he had shown even a sliver of vulnerability. She saw it as a desperate olive branch, a chance to finally earn his trust. Go tend to your brother, Abigail said without hesitation, reaching for her heavy wool coat. I will check the snare lines. It's a fair walk, Josiah warned, a flicker of guilt suddenly warring with his anger. Past the ridge and down the steep embankment. I am perfectly capable of walking to the creek, Josiah, she replied gently, wrapping a thick knitted scarf around her neck and pulling on her mittens. Stay inside where it is warm. I will be back shortly. As the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, Josiah let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He walked to the window, watching her small figure disappear into the dense, snow-laden pines. She would wander around, get terribly cold, realize she was hopelessly out of her depth, and come back crying. Then his father would see she wasn't cut out for mountain life. That was the plan. He didn't intend for the blizzard to hit 30 minutes later. It didn't just snow. The sky completely unleashed itself. The bruised purple clouds burst, dumping a blinding wall of white powder driven by gale-force winds. The temperature plummeted 15 degrees in a matter of minutes. Within the cabin, the heavy logs groaned under the sudden assault of the storm. Josiah's heart slammed against his ribs. He stood frozen at the window. The visibility was reduced to less than 10 feet. It was a whiteout, the kind of storm that killed experienced mountain men, let alone a woman from St. Louis who had never navigated a trail in her life. "Josiah?" Clara asked, coming down from the loft, shivering. "Where did Abigail go?" Josiah's voice cracked. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded his veins. "She went to the lower creek." Clara's eyes went wide with horror. "The lower creek? Josiah, Pa never sets lines at the lower creek in winter. It's too treacherous." Before Josiah could answer, the front door violently burst open, bringing with it a swirling vortex of snow and ice. Micah stumbled inside, his face wrapped in a frozen scarf, his heavy bearskin coat plastered in white. He slammed the door shut against the howling wind, leaning his back against it, panting heavily. "Worst squall I've seen in 5 years, Micah rasped, tearing off his gloves. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning the children, the hearth, the kitchen table. He froze. "Where is she?" Micah demanded, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deathly quiet. Josiah felt the blood drain from his face. His knees practically buckled under the weight of his father's gaze. "PA, Where is Abigail, Josiah?" Micah roared, stepping forward, shedding the ice from his coat like a massive, enraged bear. "She went to the lower creek," Josiah cried out, tears of absolute terror springing to his eyes. "I told her to check the snares. I just wanted her to get cold and give up. Pa, I didn't know the storm was going to break. I swear I didn't know." Micah didn't strike him. He didn't even yell. The look of utter, soul-crushing devastation that crossed the mountain man's face was 1,000 times worse than any physical blow. "If she dies out there, boy," Micah whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying blend of rage and heartbreak, "you will have killed her just as sure as if you put a bullet in her heart." Without another word, Micah grabbed his coil of rope, his hunting lantern, and a bottle of whiskey, and threw himself back out into the deadly, blinding whiteout. The woods were a screaming, freezing hell. Abigail Mercer had lost the trail 20 minutes ago. Every direction looked exactly the same, a dizzying, chaotic swirl of white. The wind tore at her clothes, slicing through her wool coat like 100 icy razors. Her boots were completely soaked, her toes completely numb, and her eyelashes were frozen together, making it nearly impossible to see. She had realized too late that Josiah had tricked her. There were no snares. There was only the endless, unforgiving wilderness, and she had walked right into its jaws. "Keep moving," she told herself, stumbling over a hidden tree root and crashing hard into a snowdrift. "If you stop, you die." She pushed herself up, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps that burned her lungs. But the cold was seeping into her bones, slowing her thoughts, replacing her panic with a dangerous, lethargic warmth. The snow began to look less like a trap and more like a soft, inviting bed. "No," Abigail whimpered, wrapping her arms around herself. She thought of baby Seth, of quiet Wyatt, of feral little Emmett. She had crossed a country to find a family, and she refused to die alone in the snow. But as she took another step, the ground simply vanished beneath her. She had wandered too close to the steep gorge of the lower creek. She tumbled down the embankment, crying out as she hit the icy ground below, her head striking heavily against a snow-covered boulder. Darkness, swift and merciful, finally swallowed her. Above the gorge, Micah fought through the storm with the desperation of a madman. He tied the rope around his waist, anchoring the other end to the sturdy pines as he navigated the treacherous, invisible edge of the creek. "Abigail!" he bellowed, his voice immediately snatched away by the howling wind. "Abigail!" His chest ached with a terrifying realization. The thought of losing her, this brave, broken, beautiful woman who had brought light back into his deadened home, was tearing him apart. He had spent months pushing her away, guarding his grief, and now he was about to lose the best thing that had happened to him since Rebecca died. He swung the lantern, catching a glimpse of disturbed snow at the edge of the drop-off. His heart stopped. Micah scrambled down the steep embankment, sliding on the ice. At the bottom, half buried in a drift, was a patch of dark blue wool. "No, no, no, God, please," Micah choked out, falling to his knees. He frantically dug her out. Abigail was completely unresponsive, her skin terrifyingly pale, her lips tinged blue. Micah ripped off his heavy bearskin coat and wrapped it tightly around her small, freezing frame. He gathered her into his arms, crushing her against his chest to share whatever body heat he had left. "Abigail, come back to me," he begged, pressing his face into her icy hair. "Please, I need you. The kids need you." He didn't wait. He threw her over his shoulder, grabbed the rope, and began the agonizing, brutal climb back up the gorge, fighting the wind with every ounce of his massive strength. When the cabin door finally blew open again, it was nearly nightfall. Josiah was sitting by the fire, his face buried in his hands, shaking violently. When he looked up and saw his father carrying Abigail's limp, lifeless body, a sob tore from the boy's throat. "Clear the table. Get the blankets from my bed. Now!" Micah ordered, his voice raw and ragged. The cabin erupted into frantic action. Micah laid Abigail gently on the wooden table. They stripped off her frozen outer layers, wrapping her in every quilt, pelt, and heated blanket they had. Clara heated stones in the fire, wrapping them in cloth and packing them around Abigail's freezing core. Micah rubbed her hands and feet viciously, trying to force the blood to circulate, while Josiah stood in the corner, paralyzed by guilt, weeping silently. Hours ticked by. The storm raged outside, but inside, the silence was agonizing. Micah sat in a wooden chair beside her, clutching her pale hand, his head bowed. He hadn't moved for 2 hours. Slowly, miraculously, the icy grip of the mountain let go. Abigail let out a shuddering, ragged breath. Her eyelids fluttered, heavy and confused. She let out a soft groan, shifting her head. Micah's head snapped up. "Abigail?" Her bruised eyes opened, struggling to focus on the warm, amber light of the cabin, and then on the rugged, exhausted face of the mountain man hovering over her. "Micah?" she whispered, her voice like cracked glass. Micah let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He carefully pressed his forehead against hers, closing his eyes, a tear slipping down his weathered cheek and landing on her nose. "You're safe. I've got you. You're home." From the shadows, a small, trembling voice broke the moment. "I'm sorry." Josiah stepped into the light. He looked 100 years older, completely broken by the weight of what he had almost done. The tough, angry facade was entirely gone, leaving only a terrified, grieving child. He walked slowly to the edge of the table and fell to his knees beside Abigail, burying his face in the heavy quilts covering her legs. "I'm so sorry," Josiah sobbed, his voice cracking with pure agony. "I didn't want you to die. I missed my ma. I missed her so much, and you were so good to Seth, and I was so angry. I'm a monster. I'm sorry." Abigail looked down at the boy who had made her life hell for months. She didn't see an enemy. She just saw a boy who needed a mother. Despite her exhaustion, Abigail slowly reached her bruised, trembling hand out from under the blankets. She rested it gently on Josiah's unruly dark hair. "I know, Josiah," she whispered, her voice full of an endless, aching grace. "I know. I've missed things I loved, too. It makes us do foolish things. But I am not angry, and you are not a monster." Josiah lifted his tear-stained face, staring at her in disbelief. You forgive me? After what I did? We are family now," Abigail said softly, her eyes meeting Micah's before returning to the boy. "And family forgives." Josiah broke down completely, burying his face against her arm, sobbing out years of pent-up grief and anger. Micah placed his heavy hand on his son's shoulder, looking at Abigail with a reverence that stole the breath from her lungs. In the depths of the deadliest winter, the ice in the Montgomery cabin had finally, entirely shattered. When the vicious grip of winter finally broke in April, the Bitterroot Mountains transformed from a freezing prison into a breathtaking paradise of emerald pines and blooming glacier lilies. The spring thaw brought rushing, crystal-clear water to the lower creek, but more importantly, it brought a profound, unshakable warmth to the Montgomery cabin. The near tragedy of the blizzard had stripped away every lingering ounce of pride and resentment. Josiah was a changed boy. The hardened, angry teenager who had once spat at Abigail's boots now shadowed her with a quiet, fierce devotion. He chopped her firewood without being asked, carried the heavy wash buckets, and even sat beside her by the hearth at night, letting her teach him how to read from a battered family Bible. Abigail had found her family. She wasn't a blood mother to these 6 children, but she was the axis on which their world now spun. She knew exactly how to soothe baby Seth, how to coax Wyatt out of his shell, and how to patch up Emmett's endless scrapes. Her eastern pallor had been replaced by sun-kissed skin, and her delicate hands were now calloused and strong. And then there was Micah. The mountain man treated her with a reverence that made Abigail's heart ache in the most beautiful way. Gone were the gruff orders and the avoiding gazes. In their place were lingering touches as they passed in the narrow kitchen, shared smiles over the chaotic dinner table, and late-night conversations by the dying embers of the fire. One evening in late May, after the children had finally fallen asleep in the loft, Abigail was out on the wooden porch, shaking out a heavy woven rug. The air was sweet with the scent of pine and damp earth. Micah stepped out of the shadows of the barn, wiping axle grease from his massive hands with a rag. He stopped at the base of the porch steps, looking up at her. The moonlight caught the silver threads that had begun to weave through his dark hair, highlighting the rugged, breathtaking strength of his jaw. "You're working late, Mrs. Mercer," Micah said softly, his deep voice carrying a husky edge that sent a shiver down her spine. "The mud on these boots respects no time of day, Micah," she teased gently, folding the rug over the wooden railing. He climbed the steps slowly, closing the distance between them until he was standing just inches away. He smelled of leather, cedarwood, and the raw, wild outdoors. Abigail's breath hitched. She looked up into his stormy blue eyes, seeing an ocean of unspoken emotions swirling in their depths. Micah reached out, his rough, scarred fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was so tender it made her eyes burn with unshed tears. "I never thought I'd hear laughter in this cabin again," he murmured, his thumb grazing her cheekbone. "I was a dead man walking before you came up that mountain, Abigail. You brought me back to life." "You did the same for me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You gave me the one thing I was told I could never have." Micah didn't say another word. He simply leaned down and captured her lips with his. The kiss was like the mountain spring itself, a sudden, overwhelming rush of heat, life, and desperate, starving passion. Abigail gasped into his mouth, winding her arms around his thick neck, anchoring herself to the man who had pieced her shattered soul back together. For 2 blissful weeks, Abigail thought her life was finally complete. They planned to ride down to Darby at the end of the month to find a circuit preacher. But the past has a cruel way of finding the people who try to outrun it. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Micah was up on the ridge repairing a damaged fence line, and Abigail was hanging laundry in the yard with Clara. The rhythmic thud of approaching hooves echoed through the valley. Abigail turned, shielding her eyes from the sun. A polished black buggy, entirely out of place on the muddy, rutted mountain road, was making its way toward the cabin. Beside it rode a man on horseback wearing a tin star, Deputy Miller from the county sheriff's office. But it was the man driving the buggy who made the blood turn to ice in Abigail's veins. Dressed in a pristine charcoal suit, a bowler hat resting on his perfectly pomaded hair, was Roland Pendleton, her ex-husband. Roland pulled the buggy to a halt, his lips curling into a sneer of profound disgust as he took in the rustic log cabin, the roaming chickens, and finally, Abigail. She was wearing a faded cotton work dress, an apron stained with blackberry juice, and her hair was braided loosely over one shoulder. "My God, Abigail," Roland drawled, his voice dripping with aristocratic St. Louis contempt. "You look like a peasant. I can smell the livestock on you from here." Abigail stepped in front of Clara instinctively, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Roland, what are you doing here?" "I've come to collect my wife," he stated smoothly, wrapping the leather reins around the brake lever and stepping down from the buggy. "I am not your wife," Abigail spat, her voice shaking with a mixture of terror and rage. "You divorced me. You threw me out because I couldn't give you an heir." Roland chuckled, a cold, empty sound. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. "That was the intention, yes. But it seems Judge Nathaniel Holmes of the St. Louis Circuit Court, a dear friend of my father's, found a sudden irregularity in our paperwork. The divorce was never finalized, Abigail. You are still legally bound to me." "Why?" Abigail breathed, the world tilting dangerously on its axis. "You despise me. You called me a barren curse. Why would you ride 2,000 miles to drag me back?" "Because your Aunt Josephine died 3 weeks ago," Roland said, his eyes flashing with raw greed. "She left her entire estate, including the controlling shares in the Missouri Pacific Railroad, to her favorite niece. As your legal husband, that inheritance belongs to me. But the bank won't release the funds unless you sign the deeds over in person." Abigail felt the air leave her lungs. It wasn't about love. It wasn't even about pride. It was about money. "I will not go with you," she said, lifting her chin. "I belong here." Roland's sneer vanished, replaced by a cold, vicious glare. He gestured to the deputy. "Deputy Miller here represents the territorial law, and the law says a wife belongs with her husband. Furthermore, if you refuse, I will press charges against the brute who lives in this shack for kidnapping and harboring a married woman. I will have him thrown in the territorial prison, and these filthy little orphans will be shipped off to an asylum before sundown." Clara whimpered, clutching the back of Abigail's dress. Abigail's heart shattered. Roland had found the one weapon that could destroy her. She could not let Micah go to prison. She could not let these children, her children, be torn apart and sent to cold, loveless institutions. "Fine," Abigail whispered, a single tear cutting through the dust on her cheek. "I will go pack my trunk." "You ain't packing a damn thing." The voice boomed across the clearing like a crack of thunder. Roland spun around, his hand instinctively dropping toward the small derringer hidden in his coat pocket. Micah Montgomery emerged from the tree line. He didn't look like a man. He looked like a force of nature. His chest heaved, his jaw was clenched so tight the muscles twitched, and in his hands he held a massive Winchester repeating rifle, the barrel resting casually but lethally across his forearm. Behind Micah, flanking him like young wolves protecting their alpha, were Josiah and Emmett. Josiah was holding his father's hunting knife, his dark eyes fixed on Roland with a hatred so pure it made the wealthy Easterner take an involuntary step back. "Who do you think you are, you backwoods savage?" Roland sputtered, trying to maintain his air of superiority. "I have the law on my side. This woman is my legal property." Micah walked slowly into the yard, stopping right beside Abigail. He didn't look at Roland. He looked down at the woman he loved, seeing the terror and sacrifice written all over her face. He reached out and wrapped his large, calloused hand around hers, intertwining their fingers. "She is nobody's property," Micah said softly to her, before turning his storm cloud eyes onto Roland. "And you are trespassing on my land." "Deputy!" Roland shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "Arrest this man!" Deputy Miller shifted uncomfortably on his horse. He looked at Micah, a man twice his size holding a Winchester, and then looked at Roland's crisp, ridiculous suit. "Now, hold on a minute, Mr. Pendleton. I came up here to keep the peace. I ain't getting into a shootout with Micah Montgomery over a St. Louis paperwork dispute." "He is harboring my wife," Roland shrieked. "She ain't your wife," Josiah suddenly yelled, stepping out from behind his father. The 14-year-old boy pointed the hunting knife straight at Roland's chest. "She's our mother. You threw her away like garbage, and now you want her back for money? You touch one hair on her head, and I swear to God, you won't make it to the bottom of this mountain alive." Roland scoffed, though his face was entirely pale. "Are you going to let a feral child threaten me?" "He ain't feral," Micah growled, stepping forward, the Winchester suddenly shifting so the barrel was pointed directly at Roland's stomach. The metallic clack-clack of Micah racking around into the chamber echoed like a cannon blast in the quiet yard. "He's my son, and he's absolutely right." Roland froze, his hands raising slightly in the air. "You listen to me, you pathetic excuse for a man," Micah said, his voice low, vibrating with a lethal promise. "Out here in the Bitterroots, we don't care about Judge Nathaniel Holmes. We don't care about St. Louis bank ledgers. Out here, a man keeps what he earns, and he protects what he loves. Abigail earned her place in this family with blood, sweat, and a love you couldn't even begin to comprehend. She is mine, she is theirs, and she is never, ever going back to a cage with you." Roland swallowed hard, looking desperately at the deputy. "He's got the drop on you, Pendleton," Deputy Miller muttered, adjusting his hat. "I'd suggest getting back in that buggy. The territorial governor ain't gonna send a posse up here for a woman who clearly don't want to leave. Law out here is a bit more practical." Humiliated, terrified, and defeated, Roland backed away slowly. He climbed into his pristine buggy, his hands shaking as he grabbed the reins. "You haven't heard the last of this?" he spat, though there was no heat left in his words. "If I ever see your face in Montana territory again," Micah replied coldly, "I'll feed you to the grizzlies and won't lose a wink of sleep." Roland whipped the horses, turning the buggy violently and speeding down the mountain road, the deputy trailing lazily behind him. Silence fell over the yard, save for the rustling of the pines in the wind. Abigail stood entirely still, her chest heaving, tears streaming freely down her face. Micah lowered the rifle, handing it to Josiah, and turned to her. He wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumbs, his eyes softening into a look of absolute, unconditional adoration. "You would have gone with him," Micah whispered, his voice cracking. "You would have given yourself back to that monster just to keep us safe." "You are my family, Micah," Abigail sobbed, finally collapsing against his broad chest, burying her face in his shirt. "I would die before I let anything happen to you or these children." Micah wrapped his massive arms tightly around her, burying his face in her hair. "We're going to Darby tomorrow. We're finding the judge. I don't care what papers that coward has back east. I'm putting a ring on your finger and making you Abigail Montgomery in front of God and everyone in this territory." A week later, in a small, sunlit meadow overlooking the Bitterroot Valley, they did exactly that. Abigail wore a simple white cotton dress Clara had helped her sew, and a crown of wild glacier lilies in her braided hair. Micah wore his best suit, standing tall and proud, holding baby Seth on his hip while the other 5 children stood around them, grinning from ear to ear. Even little Wyatt had a wildflower tucked into his suspenders. As the circuit judge pronounced them husband and wife, Micah pulled her in for a kiss that drew a loud cheer from Josiah and Emmett. Abigail looked around at the wild, rugged mountains, at the strong, devoted man holding her hand, and at the 6 beautiful children who called her Ma. She realized then that the doctors in St. Louis hadn't been entirely wrong, but they hadn't been right either. Her body may not have been able to bear a child, but her heart had never been barren. It had simply been waiting for the right soil, in the harshest of winters, to finally bloom. What an incredible journey of heartbreak, survival, and the ultimate triumph of found family. Abigail's story proves that sometimes the darkest storms in our lives are just clearing the path for the greatest blessings we could ever imagine, and that a mother's love isn't defined by blood, but by the fierce devotion of the heart. If this Wild West romance touched your soul, please hit that like button share it with someone who needs a beautiful story today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more breathtaking historical dramas. Leave a comment below. What was your favorite moment? See you next time.